In this video, I'm going to explain the UK election system for Americans and give the current election historical context. Nearly 10 years ago now, I was first messing around on YouTube with an iPad 2 and Windows Movie Maker, and I made a truly amateur, embarrassing explainer on the 2015 UK elections. My interest in the politics and history of the UK and the island of Ireland never faded, and so I'm back to make something that will, with any luck, be less cringy and give some meaningful historical context. Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called an election on May 22nd in the pouring rain. The election will take place on July 4th after 6 weeks of campaigning by the parties. What is a United Kingdom general election? It is when the Parliament of the United Kingdom is dissolved and each seat in that Parliament is up for election. The UK is comprised of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the entirety of which is divided into constituencies, which elect members of Parliament, also known as MPs, to the House of Commons, the primary legislative body of the United Kingdom. These constituencies are similar to congressional districts in the US in that they are single member and first past the post. First past the post is a complicated way of saying that the person with the most votes wins, even if that isn't a majority of the votes. So if you're running and you get 30% of the votes in your constituency, it doesn't matter you didn't reach 50 or 51%, no majority needed. As long as everyone else gets less than your 30%, you're duly elected. You win. The candidate with the most votes wins the seat in Parliament. So each one of the 650 constituencies votes for an MP, a member of Parliament. These elected MPs will rush quickly to Westminster, where the House of Commons sits, and begin legislating in a new parliamentary session. But basic civics teaches us that creating law, legislating requires governing, executing the law. In the UK, that falls to the government, aka the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So how is a Prime Minister selected? You do not go into the polling booth in the United Kingdom and vote, tick a box for the Prime Minister, like you would for the American President. The Prime Minister does not formally receive a personal mandate from the people of the UK. Instead, leaders of the major UK political parties are selected by the parties themselves. So the current Conservative Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was not elected by the general public in an election. He was selected to be the Conservative Party leader and thus Prime Minister by Conservative members of Parliament. Now, that direct selection by elites is not super common in the modern era. Sunak replaced Conservative Prime Minister Liz Truss in a political crisis. Liz Truss was shortlisted by Conservative members of Parliament, and then her and other candidates were put to Conservative Party members. She won the majority vote of Conservative Party members and was thus made party leader and Prime Minister. Don't get too bogged down in the chaotic details here. The point is that the UK Conservative Party, not UK voters, chose the leader of the party. You don't vote directly for Prime Minister. And that selection is not unique to the Conservative Party. The main opposition party, the Labour Party, also selected its leader, Sir Keir Starmer, in 2020 through the shortlisting process among members of Parliament, followed by a vote of Labour Party members. Now, it does sound similar to the way US political parties nominate presidential candidates, but the big difference is that the US candidates will be on the ballot to vote for. The UK party leaders will not be on everyone's ballot in the general election. They'll only be on the ballots in their own constituency. So members of Parliament are elected in all these constituencies. They run to be the Conservative member for Richmond, or the Labour member for Holborn and St. Pancras, or the Liberal Democrat member for Kingston and Surbiton, or the Green member for Brighton Pavilion, or the Scottish National member for Aberdeen South, or the Plaid Cymru member for Dwyfor Meirionydd, or the potential Reform member for Clacton. And all the MPs that are elected for the various parties show up in the House of Commons and choose the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister comes from the legislative body. So if one party wins the majority of the seats in the House of Commons, that would be 326 seats, they are able to form a government and begin business with their choice as Prime Minister. And important cabinet positions like Defense Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, one often overlooked position, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. The political party with a majority of MPs controls the government, ministers, and most business of the House of Commons. What if no party gains a majority in the House of Commons? This is known as a hung parliament, and this is where things get interesting. A coalition must then be formed between two or more of the parties in order to build a majority, choose a Prime Minister, and conduct business. For example, in the 2010 election, David Cameron's Conservative Party formed a coalition with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrat Party. They put the Conservatives 306 seats with the Lib Dems 57, and bam, over the 326 majority threshold. A government was formed. Most recently, Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May called a general election in 2017. The Conservatives returned from this election as the largest party in the House of Commons, with 318 seats, but not enough for a majority, 326 seats. So they entered an informal coalition, a confidence and supply arrangement with the Northern Ireland Unionist Party. the DUP, in order to conduct business. Now, here in Washington, D.C., from where I sit, I know better than to make political predictions, and I definitely know better than to make political predictions, sorry about that, in countries where I do not live. However, I'll make just one. The idea of a hung parliament or, a minority government that needs to form a coalition, that sort of thing, that's exceedingly unlikely in this election cycle. Prime Minister Boris Johnson led the Conservatives to an election majority in 2019. He was pushed out by his own party due to scandals in 2023. As we already discussed, no general election was held after this. Liz Truss was selected by the Conservatives to be the Prime Minister after Boris Johnson. Truss and her Chancellor initiated a budget that spooked financial markets and threatened a financial collapse. So she too was ejected after 49 days as Prime Minister. Conservative members of Parliament then rushed to select the runner-up in the last leadership race, Rishi Sunak, who they installed as Prime Minister without putting it to the Conservative Party members again. If that all sounds chaotic, it was, and that's reflected in opinion polling, which shows the Conservatives are polling historically poorly. If polls are correct, potentially their worst results since 1906. They've been the primary governing party since 2010 when David Cameron became Prime Minister. I don't think it's a non-objective point to make that after 14 years, voters basically hold the Conservatives responsible for the problems of the UK, and thus a, hung parliament or an indecisive result is really unlikely. Lots of commentary has been made about a general sense of decline in the UK, obviously a general decline in influence on the world stage since the end of World War II, but nowadays there's a feeling of decay in infrastructure, public services like the National Health Service, worsening economic divides in various regions, inflation, cost of living, housing pressures. You get the idea. And that's why media, including media at this moment, jumped on the detail that as Rishi Sunak announced his general election in the pouring rain, not only did it seem an encapsulation of the attitude of the UK towards conservative leadership, but right outside a protester was playing a 1993 song called "Things Can Only Get Better." My imaginary producer is telling me that this is the perfect moment to transition to the historical context, because that song, "Things Can Only Get Better," was being played at what many see as the end of 14 years of Conservative Party rule in the UK. Well, there's a glaring, obvious historical parallel. Now, the protester who played that music probably wanted to create the historical parallel for everyone in their mind, but it doesn't really make a difference. The political moment and comparison rings true as sentiment of the UK electorate as of the writing of this video. And that parallel is to the 1997 UK general election, which brought the Labour Party under Tony Blair to power. "Things Can Only Get Better" was the campaign theme of the Labour Party in 1997, and the mood of the country was similar. In 1997, the Conservatives under Prime Minister John Major had been in power even longer than the Conservatives today. 18 years of uninterrupted Conservative rule. This began with Margaret Thatcher in 1979. The dominance of the Conservative Party in the 1980s and early 90s seemed unbreakable at the time. 18 years straight, defeating the Labour Party in 4 consecutive elections. During this period, the Labour Party seemed trapped at 32% of the vote. In 1997, Tony Blair would lead them out of the wilderness and into power. And he did so in a way that I think is unmistakably similar to the way that the current Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is navigating his party. Tony Blair was born in 1953. After graduating from Oxford and passing the bar, Blair joined the Labour Party. From 1975 to 1983, he was a rank-and-file member. Blair entered political office in 1983 through his election to be a member of Parliament for Sedgefield, a constituency in a former mining area. We get a taste of the future middle-of-the-road Tony Blair in his maiden speech to Parliament upon election, in which he distances himself from the party's socialist roots. Quote, "I am a socialist, not through reading a textbook that has caught my intellectual fancy, nor through unthinking tradition. Socialism," he says, "stands for cooperation, non-confrontation, for fellowship, not fear. It stands for equality." Okay, that's incredibly generic. But nonetheless, quickly, Blair became a notable young upstart in the party. Blair advocated a centrist direction for Labour, deviating from its socialist roots. He and others, like Gordon Brown, were part of a group of so-called modernizers within the party, seeking to woo the electorate by espousing new views and new relations for their party. Modernization really just meant moving to the center of politics, moving his left-wing party, the Labour Party, to the political right. Be young, lurch right, new Labour. And this posturing paid off. Blair became leader of the Labour Party in July 1994, beginning nearly 3 years leading the opposition in the House of Commons. And in his first year in opposition, Blair made good on his promise to move the Labour Party towards the center of British politics, to prepare them for a general election. He first set about removing Clause 4 of the party platform, which called for nationalization of the economy, quote, the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Blair had particular distaste for the intellectual left, quote, what was mainstream leftist thinking in the early 20th century had become hopelessly unreal, even surreal. This socialist thinking was the first to go when Blair took over the Labour Party. Next, along that theme, he committed to business, quote, where was our business support? Where were our links into the self-employed? He cut links to trade unions, whose leaders he'd already alienated. He took away the party's commitment to nuclear disarmament, and he promised to be tougher on crime. Finally, he wanted more integration with Europe and the common market, not less. In total, on policy, we have a rightward drift. Packaged together, Tony Blair called it New Labour. New Labour promised to occupy the centre of the UK's political landscape and to give it a fresh young face, the 40-something Blair. In May 1997, Blair was finally able to put that assertion to the test in a general election against the Conservatives. On election day 97, Labour received 44.4% of the vote in the UK. The Conservatives ended with about 31%, with the rest going to smaller parties such as the Liberal Democrats. While 10 points might not seem like a landslide in a first-past-the-post system, 10 points meant Labour ended election night 1997 with 419 seats, a majority of 179, the largest in the post-war period. Election results streamed in until the early hours of the morning. As the sun began to break, Blair's team had him say a few words to supporters.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
Tony Blair's 1997 path is obviously the path that the current Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, would like to follow. It's not remotely close to an original thought from me. Starmer talks with Blair. The two even did a panel-style discussion together at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Starmer, to my eyes, is not shy about letting people see him and Blair together, making the comparison. The similarities continue. Labour was out of power for 18 years before Blair's election. Nowadays, Labour's been out of power for 14 years. Blair led the party towards the political right, away from its left-wing instincts. Starmer has also moved his party towards the political right after taking the party mantle from its previous leader, the leftist champion Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn was even ejected from the Labour Party as a clear indication that under Starmer's leadership, the party would be a different Labour, a changed Labour Party. And Starmer repeats this constantly, and he and his chancellor have signed up to the same budgetary restrictions as the Conservatives. So even on economics, they're not promising much of a leftward shift from the last 14 years. I should caveat that digging into all policy, such as Labour's proposed Great British Energy Company, you do see a difference between Blair and Starmer, but bird's eye view, they're similar figures that moved Labour rightwards in a bid to be electable. Starmer and Labour are also running an election based on competence and not a massive ideological swing. While they sell themselves as the party of change, they also say things like, in this era of conservative chaos, quote, stability is change. So they're not offering a revolution, they're selling what they call national renewal to a softer government presence in daily life. One they claim the UK people will not have to think about as much. Like, just elect us and you can check out of politics and leave it to us. There won't be drama every day, there won't be wild budgets, we'll just do the thing and you live your life. Besides the fact that Labour's on the rebound, the Conservatives are also being squeezed by a newer party, Reform UK, the newest outfit of Nigel Farage, who led the UK Independence Party, which advocated for the 2016 Brexit referendum, and later led the Brexit Party, which advocated for enacting the hardest form of Brexit. The Reform Party's current big rallying cry is immigration, and generally they're pushing themselves as a right-wing populist alternative to the Conservatives. They might win some seats, crazier things have happened, and the UK feels overdue to see some of the populist nationalism which plagues Europeans on the continent. The consensus view as of the writing of this video is that the Reform UK will siphon votes away from the Conservatives and worsen Conservative losses. The Conservatives are also being squeezed by the Liberal Democrats. Their leader is currently running his campaign through a series of goofy photo ops at water slides, paddleboarding, bike riding. They'll swipe some Conservative seats in all likelihood. And as of right now, Labour's chances of getting a majority are fairly high. That's not only because of the Conservative Party's woes with the swing to Labour plus Reform Party and the Liberal Democrats, but because the majority party in Scotland, the Scottish National Party, has been dealing with its own controversies, including the arrest of its longtime leader, Nicola Sturgeon, as part of a financial scandal. The SNP are therefore projected to win fewer members of parliament, and the next preference of Scottish voters is generally the Scottish Labour Party. So that boosts Starmer's and Labour's chances too. The big takeaway here is that the UK is set to do something anomalous in our era. As politics lurches towards the populist right in the US, Canada, Italy, Germany, very concerning, that one, Germany, Argentina, you name it, the UK is not doing that rightward lurch right the second. The UK had a Conservative Party for the last 14 years, with splits and agitations from the populist right, most notably the Brexit vote to leave the European Union. It kind of had a shakeup from the populist right already, and so the feeling in the air is a swing to the center left, a political landslide to predictable new management. If that happens, the challenge for a new Labour government will be to be effective enough to stave off a right-wing populist resurgent from a new group like Reform, or from a post-defeat, smaller, revamped Conservative Party. That's especially true if Reform outperforms expectations in this election. Labour can't be so centrist as to change nothing when they have a massive majority. For now, they're selling the message that things will stay the same. But the same things, Labour claim, can only get better. To support history videos or current event videos contextualized through history, click the link and support me on Patreon. Heads held high, happy warriors. There you go.